Welcome everyone to our next installment of the WeAreOne Sessions. My name is Nebra Josevic. As many of you know, I'm a certified senior executive coach at Neb Coaching Consulting, and I'm really, really happy to be here with you today. The way that these sessions came out is that we just thought it was a good moment to connect with people, to field all sorts of questions, and to try and sort of map the trajectory of sort of the emotional process people are going through given the times that we are in at the moment, and hopefully be able to offer some insights for everyone, and then share ideas as well, because I think together we'll not only feel the benefit of connection, but also hopefully some insights that'll help you get through this easier. So just to get started directly, we wanted to talk today about emotional management. And the reason this came about is because in our calls from last week, and also from private calls from clients, from students, from loved ones, a lot of folks have been struggling, as we have been feeling ourselves, with this idea of, how to manage this mix of emotions that is happening during this time. And as we were just previously mentioning, this idea that the situation, started off, let's say 3 weeks ago, really here. We went through that first period of adaptation, of the hit of transition, even shock. And now, as weeks have gone by, as we stay at home, we stay in confinement, as we stay together with loved ones or are alone, there's a whole host of other emotions that are coming up simply from that, restriction of movement, from the constant mixed news, and from the fact that this continues to be just like the number one thing most everybody is thinking about, which is exhausting. I mean, think about it. As much as you might love chocolate cake, if you had to think about chocolate cake all the time, it would drive you crazy, right? And so the idea about emotional management is it really relates very much to emotional intelligence. For those of you that have worked with me, we have discussed this in greater detail, but I did want to start kind of giving a little bit of a definition of what that means so we're all on the same page. Emotional intelligence has 4 major parts. The first 2 have to do with you, yourself, and the second 2 have to do with the other, right? Whoever you're communicating with or interacting with. So the first part is the ability to be able to recognize your own emotions. And then the ability to control those emotions is the second part, right? And by control, we're actually thinking manage, and we're going to talk more about what that actually means. The third and fourth part are the ability to be able to recognize effectively and accurately the emotions of another person. And then the fourth is to be able to really be able to effectively manage their emotions. And again, we're not talking about controlling other people. We're talking about the ability to influence in positive and effective ways, so you can have quality communication, decision-making, etc. This is very key, obviously, also in leadership, personal relationships, and the like. So for this particular session, since we're really taking small bits and pieces that we like to go into a little bit deeper, we'd like to really just focus on the first 2, which is about yourself. And I break these up into actually 3 elements. The first is how to be able to really become aware with what you're feeling, connect with it. Because the case for many of us is either through, socialization processes or belief systems we've been taught to really shun our emotions and put them away. The second part is about how to intelligently interpret and understand what you're feeling. So you may know that you are feeling something, especially if it's a difficult emotion, but it may be really challenging to find out what is that. And the ability to understand it effectively helps us greatly in the third part, which is how to effectively manage it. So those are the 3 areas I'd love to speak with you about today. And the key here is also they go in tandem, right? You'll see that they all connect to each other, but there is also a certain order to it. So let's start with how to connect with your emotions, okay? The objective here again is about bringing awareness and understanding not just a little bit about what you're feeling, but also how it's affecting the rest of your body, your livelihood, your psyche, etc. There's a couple of fallacies about emotions, and I'm sure most of us share them in some way. Again, these may be coming from belief systems from our families, from our cultures, from many other things, but they do importantly impact our ability to be able to both recognize and work with our emotions, as well as to be able to manage them effectively. And so one is that emotions are bad. Now, all of us want to be able to feel joy and bliss and excitement and inspiration all the time. And we spoke about that in our previous call, this idea of, being able to accept that that's not life all the time. What happens, however, is that we don't really love the feeling of anger, of boredom, of frustration, of sadness, apathy. And yet, these emotions are just simply the second half of the human condition. And so they're not bad. We call emotions in that respect signals, but they by themselves are not really good or bad, right? And we'll talk more about what that means. The second myth is that emotions are truth. Now, we just said that they're signals, but it doesn't mean that they serve as an objective truth for the entire world. So what does that say? They're telling you something about what you're going through. They're telling you something about what you're thinking, feeling, sensing, but they don't necessarily denote a truth for the entire world, for everyone else around you. So that means that if at one moment you're extremely angry about a situation or a person, that anger is valid. It's telling you something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the other is bad, because that anger may also be based on certain assumptions that you're making, some of your own characteristics, and maybe some stories you're dragging from your past that are making it worse for you, but you're also not necessarily entirely aware of the circumstances that are causing the other person to behave that way and cause that anger for you. So they're not truth. Pema Chodron, who I highly recommend to you, she's a Western monk, wonderful woman who has these beautiful little books that I call them little blessings, because they're very easy to read. They're like rolling meditations. I have a couple of them on my nightside table. And the idea is not even to get through the entire book in one reading. It's just to sort of read excerpts. She says something I think is especially powerful. She says, don't believe everything you think. And I would extend it so far as to say is, don't believe everything you feel. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not valid. It means that it doesn't necessarily represent an objective truth about everything around you. And so the third myth is actually going to seem kind of an opposite to this, but it's as well very true. And that's that emotions are unreliable. So they may not necessarily represent an objective truth, but it doesn't mean they're unreliable. Your emotions, again, are signals about what is happening inside you. Some of those signals may be about more serious situations, and we're going to break that down further. Others may be simply symptoms of a current situation, and you'll see that difference. The third myth is that emotions have to be either controlled, ignored, or always explained. And the reason that's not the case is, first of all, if we're constantly ignoring emotions, particularly emotions that keep coming back for us, what we're doing is actually ignoring an alert system in our bodies and ourselves that at some point might stop coming, but at a great cost to us. You'll notice that a lot of things like pains can be related to emotions, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to consider that, right? The second is they need to be controlled, right? We're not thinking about control like in a vice. When you try to control your emotions in a very black and white manner, what you're actually doing is repressing in many cases, what we're doing in those cases. And that often makes us have even more blind spots about what's happening with us. And the idea, the last part of this myth that emotions have to always be explained. Yes, there are times, especially with recurring emotions, that there may be a deeper reason behind what's happening for us. But there are also moments, and you've seen this, where, you haven't slept well, or there's maybe some hormonal balance. Maybe you haven't even eaten. Maybe you're going through a stressful moment. Maybe you're feeling lonely. And there may be other reasons that may exacerbate difficult emotions, but they don't necessarily mean that there's some terrible truth hidden behind it. So we don't necessarily have the ability to always fully explain 100% what we're feeling, but we can get very close to understanding it, and that's what we're heading for. Things to be aware of in terms of how to become more aware of your emotions. You need time. You need some space and silence to do it. And this is where a lot of folks struggle, because our current daily life is so focused on becoming so busy, on having to be optimally productive, on having to be so many different things to so many people, that it doesn't give us the opportunity to just sit still for a while. It may even come to the moment where a lot of folks feel uncomfortable sitting still because they haven't had that time for a while. And then all these difficult emotions will rush back and they feel overwhelmed. But the idea behind it is that no matter what is going on with you personally and professionally, having it a little bit of moment to set aside for yourself whenever, to just check in, not necessarily even reflect deeply, but just check in and see how you feel is key. The other thing is that this has a lot to do with your self-knowledge and your self-awareness. There are folks who have a very rich internal life. They understand themselves very well because they've been working on themselves for a long time. Other folks, not so much, and there's no judgment in either case. But situations like we've been saying, like being stuck inside, confined, either alone and with others, has a way of putting up a mirror to ourselves. And so I would say that instead of just fighting it, this is an especially important, also privileged moment to be able to kind of turn in and say, hey, what's going on with me, right? Is this a moment where I can maybe bring a little bit more ease, a little bit more knowledge to myself? And the last is, that's really important about becoming aware of your emotions, is some self-compassion. Self-compassion isn't about just letting yourself off the hook. It isn't about giving in. It's just about peacefully, without judgment, being able to recognize, hey, this is what's happening for me. And we'll talk more about that. And it's just the way it is. And it's okay. Now, where do I go from here? Because we spend a lot of time beating ourselves up for what we're feeling. And that actually ends up using up very important emotional credits and energy that we could be funneling in a more effective way to get feeling better. So how do you become more aware of your emotions? As we kind of hinted earlier, one part is this mind-body connection. You've heard people talk about this a lot over the last years, I'm sure. And how does this appear? Well, as we said before, it can come through pain. If these days you're feeling aches and pains, itching, allergic reactions, different effects in your sleep, in your nutrition, different cravings, all of these may be signs that, you know, you're just dealing with a new transition, some change, and maybe some frustration. That's not bad. It just is, right? So there's a really great doctor and scientist, very famous, Dr. Sarner. If you've heard of him, I highly recommend his work too. He did amazing medical research proving that a lot of back pain is actually connected to repressed emotions, often around repressed emotions like anger and sadness. And so, whereas the idea of the body-mind connection was something that was still thought to be rather mystical some years ago, it's pretty much been proven at this point. And again, the idea is not to judge it, but take note of it, right? And then figure out a way to work with it. Another is just simply asking yourself out loud, how am I feeling? I do this when I'm in the bathroom, because you got to sit on the toilet anyway, right? You got to sit. So what else are you going to do? You can just say, how am I feeling? And you may be able to answer at the moment, maybe not, but it's just a half second for you to check in. The other part that I really like about this is the idea of talking out loud. That's also for some reason a stigma, you know, this idea of you can't speak out loud because it might seem like you're crazy, but it's actually been shown through research that talking out loud to yourself is immensely helpful in being able to organize your brain. And if you're feeling awkward, put your plants in front of you, put your kids in front of you, put your dogs in front of you, your pets. But either way, I would highly recommend it. And even just a couple of minutes of speaking to yourself as if you were speaking to a coach, you know, or even tapping into what we say kind of your higher self can go a long way. The other part is look at some emotional patterns. You know, every time I sleep, I don't get enough sleep, I tend to have these kinds of emotions. If I'm eating these kinds of foods, every time we bring up the topic of money in the couple, we get nervous and it causes X issues. So try and see sort of the patterns that are bringing up some tense or difficult engagements for you, even just for yourself. Being able to track that allows you to kind of pinpoint what are trigger points or sensitive topics, and then you can either work around them or work with them. And the last is in terms of how to be able to really tap into what you're feeling is to verbalize. And verbalizing emotions, other than just saying them out loud, may not even be as clear as saying, I'm feeling sadness. If you have that kind of clarity, that's wonderful. But it could also be, simply having visions. I don't mean like mystical visions, but, someone once said, for example, I feel like I'm dragging this cloud around with me. Or, there's a heaviness in my chest that I can't seem to unblock. Another person said, I feel like I'm in a cocoon and I'm kind of in development and I can see outside, but I can't quite get out yet. Use the full breadth of your imagination to come up with even sometimes words, even seemingly unrelated words, to try and denote kind of what's happening with what you're feeling. This is a creative exercise as much for you, but sometimes, especially if you're a person that may struggle with verbal communication, but even not, being able to just find images or a color or smell or whatever to associate can give you some more clarity about what you're feeling. And so that's the first third of this, which is the idea of how to become more in touch, more aware of what you're feeling. The second part, as we said, is about how to intelligently understand and interpret it. Because again, you may be feeling discomfort, but it may be very difficult to understand, if that discomfort is anxiety or is apathy, and then not just that, but where is it coming from, right? Where is it connected to? The objective in that sense is to really be able to more clearly identify what's happening for you and understand it better in terms of causes or just its characteristics. Things to be aware of, it's subjective. So you may have a similar feeling, sensation, emotion that in one moment, because of particular circumstances, you'll interpret one way, and in another moment, you'll interpret it a different way. Sometimes it can be helpful to touch base with people who know you well and who you trust to get some insight. My husband sometimes is very good at seeing from the outside, and in that safe relationship that we have, being able to say, well, I think, this happened last time, this was the case with you, a pattern that I might not have seen. Or I see you react this way usually when these kinds of other elements are there. So I think it may be that. Remember that it's always up to you to decide what you're feeling. But having a bit of insight from trusted loved ones can also give some insight on that. It also depends then on your ability to see things objectively. We touched on this a little bit in the previous call, but this idea of, if you're always in this loop, what we call sometimes this emotional sabotage of just going down the rabbit hole and feeling what you're feeling without being able to kind of create a little bit of distance, then it's almost impossible to be able to also reflect on what's happening to you. So it actually is possible to be feeling something deeply, but still reserve a certain part of your consciousness to look back on yourself. We call it the fly in the wall or the zoom camera, but just it's a muscle like anything else that if you start to practice a little bit more will actually become easier. And again, self-knowledge. The more that you learn about how you work, and also remember that how you work now will likely have been different than how you worked before or how you might work in the future. These are not things that we, as we say, marry ourselves to. Those are not judgments about you. It's just the person I am right now is functioning in this way, and that's okay, right? So how do you do this? How do you get a better idea of what exactly is happening for you and why? As we said, know your emotional profile, right? If you are sensitive to certain things, if you are going contextually through certain particular situations right now that are difficult for you, if there are relationships that you keep trying to uphold that aren't working for you, all these different things will help you understand how your particular way of feeling and feeling things and what you're feeling becomes relevant for you, right? And again, really no judgment here. Everybody's different. We all have a different emotional signature at any one moment in time, just like we have different color hair, different specialties and strengths, etc. The idea is that as well as also take into account the emotional context. If you are, which we are right now, going through an especially challenging moment, You already have a certain excuse about what may be causing you to feel some complex emotions. But again, consider other things. It's not always you, right? When it comes to stress and it comes to emotions, there's the part that is how you're dealing with things. And another thing is what you're having to deal with. So I'll give you an example of mine. I'm very sensitive, I've realized over the last years, to cruelty and injustice. And so while I used to force myself to watch, the typical Netflix shows, etc., I just started to realize that I can't stomach it very well. It affects how I sleep, especially since we tend to watch this more in the evenings. And especially during moments when there's a lot of other stuff going on, I just feel like it's taking more away from me than it's giving. This is not an objective judgment on these kinds of TV shows. For other people, they represent a great escape, but for me, they don't. And so I just, without apology, starting saying, I'm not going to watch this kind of stuff anymore. I know sometimes also that sleep is really critical for me. And so I've also had to learn that I go to sleep early, especially during stressful moments. And if I got to get 10 hours, that's what I'm going to do. Right? So the more you know how you're functioning and the more you know how situational factors affect you, the better you can also manage and understand what's happening. The third part is also not to overanalyze. It's great to get more insight about how you work, what you're experiencing at any one moment in time. But if you're overanalyzing yourself on a regular basis, it also becomes obsessive and frustrating. There's actually great research that's shown that people who spend too much time trying to get happy are the least happy people, right? So it's just the idea of kind of don't overdo it. It's great to check in, but the rest of the time, let yourself live, right? Just go back to living and going on it. And the balance between these two things is key. And the last part also is don't judge, as we've said before, and don't intellectualize. And I'd like to go in a little bit into more detail what that means. Not judging means that if you're having a moment where you're feeling anger, that doesn't necessarily make you an angry person. If you have a moment of envy or jealousy, that doesn't necessarily mean that globally as a fixed trait, you are a jealous or an envious person. If you're seeing these things coming up for you on a regular basis, that's something to be worked with. But this idea of really be careful that because you feel something in one moment doesn't mean that that is a characteristic or a quality that you have to fight with or justify for the rest of your life. The human experience is nuts, okay? We are all, though very few of us want to admit it, we are all thinking and feeling crazy shit a lot of the time. Let me tell you, as a coach, you hear people's stories. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I'm so sorry, I'm crying in a session. Or I'm so sorry, whatever. And I say to them, I've cried more than you in the last week. At the end of the day, there's so much going through us. That's why it's so beautiful we can't read each other's minds, right? Because that's part of the human experience, and that's okay. So over judging every single thing that goes through your head is just going to cause you grief. And again, it's going to take away a lot of energy, much needed energy, and focus on things that are really important and reflections that will really help you out. Intellectualizing means not actually allowing yourself to enter a feeling. That's, it's great to get some objectivity if you are particularly kind of afraid or hesitant to look at your emotions. It's great to start from an intellectual perspective, kind of trying to explain as if you were giving a talk about what might be going on with you. But the problem with intellectualizing above and beyond and never actually letting yourself feel a feeling is that you won't get the results you're looking for. You may get some clarity, but you can't really work through an emotion or grow from emotions if you're not willing to actually tap into what they are, if you're not allowing yourself to actually feel it. And that's what brings us to the last part, because a lot of people are going to say, screw you, Nev, how much more anxiety can it take, right? So here's a couple of things when it comes to managing emotions effectively. Okay, again, as we said, it's not controlling, it's not squeezing it. Imagine trying to squeeze in your palm a whole lot of sand, right? You can't hold it all, it starts to seep out. And again, when we try to do that with emotions, not only are we repressing them, but we're also putting undue pressure on ourselves to exert a kind of control that actually, I think, doesn't exist to that degree, right? You'll actually find that to be able to manage, flow with it, a mixture of accepting it and trying to understand it a bit and then working to channel it is a lot more effective than trying to, in this black and white, rigorous way, control it as if it was, a project. So the other thing about it too is it's not about repressing either. We do some work here recently, which I really love. And if you're interested, let me know. It's called shadow work. It comes from Carl Jung, famous psychologist you all know. And the idea of shadow work is this idea that there's a great amount of ourselves that has been repressed in the process of growing up, right? We had to be socialized. And so that means that our caregivers, parents, but also educators and the like, kept giving us messages around what's okay to have, right? You can't be angry. You can't fight. You shouldn't be jealous. You should be hardworking, right? So to some degree, this process is very important. On the other hand, in the process of being socialized, we've also been taught to repress and push away parts of ourselves that as we get older become important to reintegrate again. Things like it actually is okay to feel jealousy and envy sometimes. If this is obsessing you, like anything that obsesses you, it's going to cause its damage. But we are all human. We all get to be selfish, afraid, angry at times, right? We all get to be sad, despondent, apathetic. This is the range of emotions that are part of being human. It's our right to be this. The question is that when you just work from this place, then your overall effectiveness in life and your livelihood can be affected. So the objective is to acknowledge, now that we've kind of become aware of our emotions, we've gotten some clarity what they're about. Now it's about to acknowledge them and then channel work with them in the best way possible. Eckhart Tolle, if you've read the powerful book from many years ago, The Power of Now, and he's got a lot of wonderful courses too. He said, rather than being your thoughts and emotions, be the awareness behind them. And this is the idea a little bit of creating this sense of objectivity, right? Instead of falling into that chaos head first, allow yourself to feel it, but you can also pull away from them while still facing it, saying things like, this is what's happening instead of I am this. This is frustration instead of I'm frustrated, right? Or this is the moment that I'm experiencing right now. But not going headfirst in a way to so completely own everything that you're feeling. So we say also other ways to manage this. Don't push it away, don't flee, but at the same time, don't feed it. This idea of the good wolf and the bad wolf. If you're always feeding the negative visions about what's around you, if you're creating more arguments, looking for more things on the internet, telling those stories to yourself to keep strengthening all that is upsetting you, then it's very hard to move forward. So the idea is don't push it away, but there's a way to stop and say, this is what I'm feeling. Let's be in the moment, and then let's work on beyond it. We said again about not judging, but the idea is also don't identify with it. So not only does the fact that if you're feeling an emotion doesn't mean that you are that emotion all the time, but there's this beautiful concept that comes from this woman, Stephanie Bennett Voigt. She's got this great course on Daily Om about unblocking emotions. She's got 2 of them. And she says this wonderful idea. She says, imagine that, every day, all the time, we're having this great barrage of thoughts, of emotions, all of us, right? And consider that to be weather. It's weather like it's rain, like it's snow, like it's sunny, like it's cloudy. Consider that whole flow of emotions and thoughts weather, but you are the sky. You are solid, right? And if you consider that as part of your human experience, it becomes easier to not identify so much with every single fluctuation that's happening with you emotionally. Think about when you're on a plane. For those of you who know me, you know how much I hate flying, much as I need to do it. And that's a fear, right? That's a fear I've had for almost all my life, but we do it. But I always get really impressed that, I hate turbulence. You take off and it's, it's rocky. And even when it's not rocky, it's rocky for me, right? But especially when it's crap weather, you know, especially when you go through those clouds, right? I feel like, oh my God, we're in a speeding bullet. This is crazy. And then you break through the clouds, and I'm always surprised that on the other side of it, it's sun. You know, when you break through the clouds and you're up there, it's always gorgeous up there. That's where you're the sky. So if you can use that as a visual as well, it may be a good way to accept what's happening, but also not integrate yourself too much with all the detail of it. Don't react. You know, the difference between reacting and responding is reacting is just kind of this impulsive action, versus responding is just taking those first few breaths to breathe first before you act, before you make a decision. It can be really tough. And again, everything we're talking about is not perfection, okay? We're not talking about this is the way you always have to be. These are best practices that can help, ways to train your emotional muscles that can ease your life, but it happens to all of us. You know, the dog is barking too much and the neighbors, you lose your crap, and next thing you know, you're screaming. Your kids are driving you nuts and it comes out. It happens to all of us. The idea is just also understanding that sometimes being able to take a couple of breaths before can actually do amazing wonders. They found in recent research that it's insane, really, that it's so powerful that even if you're not someone who's practicing meditation on a regular basis, just learning to take a few natural deep breaths a day has been proven to greatly reduce, you know, heart disease, stress-related diseases as well, all kinds of issues, not to mention reducing anxiety, depression, but we just don't give ourselves that time. So this idea of don't launch yourself, try and take those few breaths when you're feeling something, even if you have to get out of Dodge for a while and be alone. We talked about, we talked about speaking out loud, but it's also been proving that it's really wonderful to write things down. Right. And so those of you who have worked with me, we've heard about this as well, that this idea that when you pull things out of your head, when you put them on paper, you actually have much more ability to work with them. And this is as much true for creative and entrepreneurship ideas or any kind of ideas as it is for dealing with fear. Now, the concern most of us have around this is this, oh God, I'm feeling so poorly. If I put it out on paper, if I name it, it's going to give it more power. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. When you put it down on paper, you get to see it. And one of the particularly helpful exercises in cognitive psychology is, you know, either regularly in the mornings or at nights, or when it's happening to you through the day, to sit down and write in detail. And this is the key, and use a pen. It's not on the computer, right? Not digitally. Write down in detail the fears or the anxieties or the worries that you're having. So it's not like, oh, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my job. It's like, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job and there's not going to be enough money, and try and follow it. Really, it feels uncomfortable in the beginning, but once you start writing them down, and the key here is to be really diligent, even rewrite the ones that keep coming up that are stubborn. Over time, what happens is that your brain gets bored. And if you do this over a while, the brain gets so tired of hearing the same crap all the time that it actually loses the sting from a lot of these fears. You can also then take the moment that as you write down these concerns, go back and with each one of them specifically, find logical, reasonable counter arguments, right? I will lose my job and then we're going to run out of money and then I'm going to end up on the street. Well, I'm a capable professional. I will be able to find a job. It's not like the entire market is going to implode. I will find a job. I'm willing to work. I'm able to work, or we have savings. My partner also works, etc. We have people who can help us. We won't end up on the street, right? So even if there are things that you feel less likely that you'd want to take advantage of, at least knowing that there are options takes you out of that self-sabotaging cycle of this is the only thing that can happen. And as we say, when you get that worst fear, ask yourself, is this really true? Is this really all there is? Am I sure? Am I sure this is exactly what's going to happen? The other part is being able to stay with your emotion. And this is the one that's one of the most uncomfortable, but extremely powerful. What this means is we talked a little bit about breathing, but it also means that, you know, most of us are distract away. I feel uncomfortable, get away from it. But actually being able to sit with it, not dive into it, but sit with it, actually dispels it in many cases. It's quite incredible. You think you're going to have to sit with it for a very long time, but often within minutes, it will start to dissipate. Again, the idea is don't keep feeding it. Don't keep looking for arguments and evidence for why it's true. Just sit with it. So it might look like this. I don't know why I feel it, but I feel super uncomfortable right now, and I feel super inadequate and whatever. And just sit and breathe. It sounds silly, but it's marvelous. Now, it may not work for you all the time, but again, if you do practice this over a while, what it does is it just lets your body feel that emotion. And then even your own self-preservational instincts will kick in. And just after a while, they can't keep feeling that anymore. The key is not to feed it, right? Just sit with it as it is. And the other thing is also, you know, as we said, this is about accepting part of our situation right now, but any situation you're in that is particularly overwhelming like this is to also accept this is where we are. We are in this situation right now. It's not going to be comfortable. Life isn't comfortable all the time. But you can also, when you're feeling crappy or any challenging emotion, try and orient yourself towards the emotion you want to feel, right? So if you're feeling inadequate, maybe the next thing to try and focus on is the reasons that you are adequate. The reasons that you want to feel supported, that you want to feel powerful enough, that you want to be already worthy. And work on that. It may feel awkward in that moment, but after a while, just like anything, our emotions get the better of us because we feed them most of the time, right? It's that selective perception. But if you try and orient towards something else, and you put some due diligence into it, even if it feels like you're faking it in the beginning, it'll work. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, is about rest. When there's a lot of emotional stuff happening, as we spoke in the previous call, it's a lot of emotional credits that are constantly working in the background, whether you feel it or not. They're just processing and trying to keep you going, trying to keep you calm for yourself, for others, trying to keep you functioning, productive, whatever it is you think you need to be doing. And so if you're feeling some aches and pains, if you're feeling some, you know, need to just push away, then do it. And make sure you get plenty of rest in the process, because especially these days, we're needing it. So those are some of my thoughts for you today. I'd love to hear your particular questions or suggestions, ideas. What are you thinking? Any thoughts?
For me, can you go back to what you were saying about shadowing and explain to me a little bit more what you mean by shadowing?
Oh, this is one of my favorite new topics from the last 2 years. So shadow work is this idea that through socialization, in order to become appropriate citizens of any society, we'd had to have some of our, let's say, wilder or less appropriate behaviors pushed out of us, rejected, right? Things like don't be angry, don't hit people, right? Don't steal. Elements that have roots in who knows what, in our personality or just the expression of different emotions. And we were told this is not okay. And so what happens is that all of these repressed emotions become set aside, and they become your shadow. So what that means is that it becomes that much more difficult for us to recognize and accept with compassion that we all do feel these less attractive emotions at times. It can be sadness, it can be anger, it can be envy, it can be selfishness, anything. It can be pride. It depends on what the messages were when you were growing up. I've had people say to me, for example, you know, the idea of being in a bad mood was so disapproved of in my family that we just stopped being able to recognize when we were angry or sad or down. And so these days, when this person feels that, they just automatically bypass these emotions and go to exhaustion, because the only thing that was allowed is you were allowed to be tired, right? So when we disconnect from these emotions, we don't see their effect in our lives, and we can become particularly strict around the ways that we try to control ourselves because it's not appropriate. It's human. And so shadow work is about coming back to realize your full humanity. As Jung said, I'd rather be whole than good. Sure, we're trying to all be good people, but if you're just trying to be the best possible person you are, and you're not recognizing the full breadth of your humanity, then you're going to be struggling a lot with self-pressure, with aches and pains, with, difficulties in how to manage the emotions you were told you were not allowed to have. And there's also something called the golden shadow. And the golden shadow are what would otherwise be thought of as technically positive emotions or positive traits, but that for whatever reason, we're still discouraged. And getting in touch with your golden shadow, we all have all of this, is actually the key to becoming successful later in life and really tapping into your creativity and your brilliance. So golden shadow things can be, for example, being different, being more bold, being more vibrant, having ideas that are outside the usual, right? Because maybe someone said, don't stick out. Don't be too confident. You look like you're going to, you look like you're being arrogant. Don't be too outspoken because, good people are quiet and they listen and they don't speak. These kinds of messages. And later on, when you tap into the fact that maybe you are a good communicator, maybe you are extremely creative, but in ways that are not conventional. Maybe you have this boldness in you. It can also be, there's many different elements of it. Once you reincorporate that back, you're now able to tap into the full breadth of your talents. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
It's wonderful work. It's tough work, but it really helps people truly get to that concept of self-compassion, which is not just, again, it's not just giving in. It's not just letting yourself off the hook. It's accepting yourself as you are, and then really being able to take more wholesome measures to move towards whatever you want to move towards. Anyone else? Any other questions, things you're experiencing? What you're mentioning, Les, is really important. And I'm glad that you bring up the fact that, for some people, this means something different than for others, right? People who are recovering from this disease, people who are on the front lines, who are having experiences that are more extreme. To your point, as you say, one of the best things we can do, though it is hard, is to accept where we are and also have patience to know that it'll take some time. Anyone who's gone through a tragedy, who's gone through grief, this is part of the process. And the one thing I would say from having gone through my own versions of it is give yourself time and give yourself breath, because there's ups and downs with that. There's days, and a lot of people right now, even not in the same situation as you are going through kinds of grief. What is this going to mean for the human race? What is this going to mean for the world? What I would say is this is also a good moment, and this is not just kind of a palliative, but a lot of where we end up from this is going to really depend on where we are putting our intention, right? What are we trying to manifest? One of the things we're going to talk about on next week's call, excuse me, is the fact that, we have this holiday coming up. Okay, it's a holiday, it's Easter, but on the other hand, there's a lot of folks who are going to be in imposed vacation. So forget about, August and the usual fun that they have that they look forward to all year. They've got to take that vacation out so they can get paid, with the reality that the summer will likely be very different for many, right? It's completely changing, or even our cultural and family trends and schedules. And so one of the things we want to talk about next week is going to be a lot about how to actually find some joy in this, how to rediscover different interests and really kind of shift focus as best as possible, but also how to help people find a new project, find a new vision, find something that they can work towards. Because one of the things that is coming back from feedback from people is that, there are those who are working like crazy, and it's okay, they're distracted. But there's a lot of folks that, because either work is on hold or, as we said, are retired or whatever, that are just floating. That suddenly there's all this time, and it's all this time that nobody is going to structure for them. They have to structure for themselves. And so we're realizing that trying to help folks and find and reorient towards something that's meaningful for them right now. Forget what it was a month ago or 2 weeks ago, but something that's meaningful right now, to channel that energy can do a lot to ward off things like depression, apathy, hopelessness, helplessness. Because the truth is, we do have to prepare for where we're going to end up after this. And as you said, you're going to probably have to self-isolate for a little bit longer, but it's going to end. It's going to end. And so the question is, when it ends, where do you want to be? Where do we all want to be? Professionally, personally, what could we be preparing for right now to the degree that we can, without any super self-intensity or self-demand, but how can we slowly, bit by bit, start to prepare for something that is positively meaningful for us, so that when this does end, we're not walking out into a blank slate, into a kind of hangover from not being or doing anything, but actually feel like we can hit the ground running. But don't hesitate to come to me, okay? One-on-one, and we can also talk about that. Anyone else? Any questions? Any thoughts? I hear you, Les, and I can't tell you how many times we just had a meeting this morning with one of the people from our team, and they were saying the same thing, and another person said it the other day, the exhaustion of prepping and then the exhaustion of undoing, when you come back home. I think this is so widespread, this fear. And that's the thing, as you say, I think one of the things that we've been doing is trying to be very careful with the information that we get. And having had some information directly, because we have people who are in the medical industry, we've a couple of things that we've tried to clarify, right? And so in this case, I'm not an expert in this, but things like, yes, it's on surfaces, like any flu can be on surfaces for a while, but at the same time, it can't last on surfaces forever. So things that we've gotten delivered, we just leave out in the hall for a couple of days. It can't sit there extensively. The other thing too is that it's still by droplets, right? So if you're careful and you're covering yourself, and you're washing things off and you're washing your hands, you should be fine. That doesn't mean that there's of course any guarantee, but this is not airborne, right? So I think that's also important to understand. It is difficult, as you say, that when you have someone who is at risk. I have also one of my closest friends who is the head ICU nurse at a major New York City hospital, and her husband is a high risk case, and she's taking care of 15 nurses, and some of the things they tell me, are worrisome, but they're seeing the worst cases. On the other hand, now we're also seeing, my colleague Monica the other day wrote that her, a family member had a beautiful send off by nurses, very elderly man, and he recovered, and recovered fine. So I think it's these moments where we're getting mixed information, where our daily practices are becoming so complicated. The key in this is, I think, a major element is how to reduce that fear. We can't control because we just want the guarantee that it's not going to happen to us. But then what the question would be, what do you need to do to try and calm that fear, right? How do you prep yourself before you go out? What can you say to yourself out loud? What can you say to yourself when you come back to try and disarm a little bit, this, at times rising panic that happens. And so every person has different things, but I would say in this point, the curve is flattening in Spain, China's in massive recovery. We're seeing elderly people who are recovering much, much more elderly, actually elderly, you're not elderly, who are recovering. No, I mean, like, I don't consider, even my parents are apparently at risk, but I don't see them as well. But at the same time, I think it's just trying to hold on, as we were saying in the last session, hold on to what makes you feel safe. Is that, managing a little bit different, how or when you go to the store? Is that, how do you prep yourselves, before Anton leaves and then when he comes back? Is that searching out actively things that are going to make you feel safer in this, information that's going to make you feel safer? Because what is infuriating is seeing so many newspapers who, you know, are, you know, this many dead. And then you don't realize that actually when you read the article, so many more have recovered. Or, you know, these supplies have come in, oh, these are not good. No, it's only one batch out of everything else that was actually extremely helpful. So really trying to, and yeah, I agree. You know, to be honest, and this is everybody else's prerogative. This is a personal thing. This is by no means any advice, but we just stopped looking. It just came to a point where we're getting new information, fine, but this is a progression. This is a curve. You can see it happening clearly if you're seeing countries that are just getting started with it versus the ones that are, you know, that are now well into it. We are one of those. So it has its course to run. And I think at the end of the day, it's also, as we said, it's hard to do, but kind of making peace with, do the best that you can, and you're doing it. You know, for me, for example, I needed to stock up. And then I went through like cleaning the cabinets and stocking everything, you know, super well. I don't know how much of that I did for us. One of the things we spoke about, Anton, in the last call about how to hold on to these things that make you feel hopeful, make you feel safe. And one of those is, you know, find a vision of something that's important to you right now that you can see positive out of this situation. And for a lot of folks, that's either that, oh my gosh, in such a short amount of time, we are massively seeing positive results for the earth, you know. Others are saying maybe finally we're going to realize that we don't own the earth and that we're inhabitants here, you know, and that maybe we'll learn a more respectful and cohesive way to live with everyone else and everything else on this planet. Others are saying, gosh, I haven't connected properly with folks because I've been so busy in my own world. And now you ask yourself, what are we so damn busy about that we don't have time for those we love the most, you know? So this is also that when you're going out there in those moments when you feel nervous, you know, is that you say, I'm the brave warrior who's going out to get food for me and my love and my family? Is that, you know, whatever, is that we're going to make such a beautiful meal because you're amazing cooks. And I still remember from last time, and we're going to do something super special to celebrate this effort. Is it that the sky will get bluer, you know, in other places around the world? Just hold on to that, because that's what we spoke about last time. Hope is not silly. It's not stupid. It's not naive. I keep saying hope, you know, is the wisdom of the brave. So I think you're fighting out there. The same when I speak to my friends who are medical professionals who've had some moments really tough. You know, you are warriors. You're going out there. You're really saving us. So right now, every message of that kind that can keep us going is gold. Any other thoughts, folks, before we end?